Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. As I said before, I'm Sue Giddens from the Neurological Foundation, and in collaboration with the University of Auckland's Centre for Brain Research, the Neurological Foundation is thrilled to present this evening's event. This is the second event in Brain Awareness Week that we are holding in collaboration with the Centre for Brain Research, and we have another fully booked lecture tomorrow night, or panel discussion event I should say. And marking Brain Awareness Week globally to promote the importance of brain research, and the Neurological Foundation, as many members will attest this evening, raises money from the community, individuals, and the community to fund brain research, which is critical, as you will find out this evening. Research of the brain, brain disease and brain injury has made incredible progress thanks to the tireless work of researchers and the advancement of remarkable technology. Innovative scanning or imaging now allows us to peer into the brains of people while they're alive and awake to discover the complex mechanisms involved in mood, memory, movement, and importantly, disorders of the brain. Tonight, panel chair, Associate Professor Ralph Buck, will engage with our distinguished panel to understand the crucial role that creativity plays in helping us to adapt to new experiences and environments, learn new information and create new memories, and what happens when the links between cognitive flexibility, creativity and imagination are impaired through disease and injury. Our chair, Professor Buck, is Head of Dance Studies at the University of Auckland. He's been recognised with several teaching and leadership awards. His research has been presented around the world and has featured in leading research journals and books. Associate Professor Buck's work with the World Alliance for Arts Education and UNESCO draws attention to the potential roles of dance as the dynamic agent for change within security, health and education concerns. As one of the newest members of the Centre for Brain Research, Associate Professor Buck is investigating the roles of dance within neuroscience research. Please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Ralph Buck to chair this evening's discussion. So I'm actually going to kick off the panel discussion this evening by asking you a question, Ralph, and that is, how have you recently fused the arts with brain research?
Thank you, Sue, and thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see you all here tonight, and thank you panelists for being here as well. It's great. I suppose my interest in the arts and the brain is really the whole person. I'm very interested in the dancing body and the dancing brain, and how we teach and learn, and how basically I can use dance as an agent for change. So just down the road in St. Peter's College, as I was walking up here, I saw 50 young men dancing, and they were all rehearsing for Polyfest, which is happening in South Auckland right now, the world's largest youth dance festival. And my dream is that all of that amazing energy, cultural knowledge, dynamic power can be harnessed to other effects other than cultural information, etc. It's extraordinarily powerful in building communities, it's extraordinarily powerful in building individuals. But I think dance has this unbelievable power in well-being, in developing the whole human. And part of that is in brain research and how we can draw on that when we get ill or when we need to attend to particular health concerns. So that's my interest, and my particular interest in, if that's my belief, then how do I teach teachers to get and harness that energy so as the next generation can use that information, that experience, to build stronger memories, to build stronger lives, to have healthier well-being. So I'm here for the long term, Sue. It's a long-term project I'm on. So that's my interest. And when I was reading different notes about Donna and Michael and Edward, I was sort of seeing overlaps between our interests in words like memory, creativity, imagination, experience, etc. So I'm very keen to hear their esteemed views, and I think we'll hit the road.
Good.
Right.
Well, enjoy.
Thank you very much.
You.
So And also, everyone, at the end, when we've spoken for enough, there'll be plenty of time for questions. So do write down questions or think of what you might want to ask us. So, Michael, you're Emeritus Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Auckland. Can you give a brief outline of what your research is all about and your interests?
Well, I spent something like 16 years of my life studying people with split brains. That is, people who've had the two sides of their brain cut in half, sectioned. That was done primarily in the 1960s, or it had been tried earlier, for the relief of intractable epilepsy. There aren't many patients in the world, but I've tracked down most of them in the 16 years that I worked on that particular problem. I'd just like to say something about that, actually, before I move on to another related topic. And that is, this was done in the 1960s, and I think that was the period that led to the sort of left brain, right brain myth, if you like it. The idea that the left brain and the right brain are completely different and have completely complementary properties. I mean, you've only got to look at the brain to see how similar the left sides and right sides are to kind of scotch that idea. But it was discovered in the split brain that it was the left side of the brain that is responsible for speech, although the right side, it was discovered, could understand language. And I think from that, and from some discoveries about things that the right brain seemed to be slightly better than the left brain at doing, that the idea that they were completely different and opposites, and the whole left brain, right brain story grew, and it's still with us. So one of the things I'd like to scotch, if you like, is the idea that there really is this fundamental difference between the left and right brains. After we kind of lost patients, I should say, in both senses of the word, because the patients kind of dried up. They don't do the operation nearly as much anymore. So I shifted to brain imaging to try and look at how the different sides of the brain light up to different kinds of activities. And the first thing you notice, of course, that it's never the case that one side of the brain lights up and the other doesn't, even with language tasks. So asymmetries of the brain are certainly there, but they are relative rather than absolute. So that was one of the first lessons I learned, if you like, by looking at brain imaging to look at left brain, right brain differences. The other thing I'm interested in these days is mind wandering. Our minds wander about half the time, so I've already lost about half of you, I think. And I kind of think that mind wandering, actually, rather than the left and right sides of the brain, is the secret to creativity. The brain, in my view, is a creativity engine. It creates different ideas all the time, and it does it partly on a random basis. I think dreams are the best example of that, where almost anything goes. Random images flit back and forth, random stories. So this is the brain being creative. The problem, of course, is to kind of capture it. So the problem of creativity is not that we don't have creative brains, it is to recognize when they produce something that's useful. So that's really my current take on where I think creativity is coming from.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. So, Edward, are you left-handed or right-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Does it matter?
Matters a lot for me.
Does it matter a lot for you? So you're a consultant neurosurgeon, and you've been doing this for 29 years, and also a clinical director of neurosurgery at the Auckland District Health Board.
Recently retired.
Recently retired.
Yes.
And you're right-handed. So what else do you do in your now new retired?
Well, I'm still an operating surgeon, but I retired from being the manager, and that's a wonderful sense of creativity suddenly comes upon you all of a sudden. You have time to think, and your job seems so much better. But I go back, and my mind was wandering when Mike was talking, as it often does when he talks, because he's got such a beautiful voice, and I listen to Mike and think, I'd like to go to all his lectures, aren't they good? And I wandered back to my time in London when I went to London first, thinking I was to be a psychiatrist, because this brain stuff was a bit boring, and I wanted to know about the mind and creativity, I suppose, but mainly the mind, and I listened to the psychiatrist talking, and there was a wonderful group of neurologists teaching there. I was just lucky. They were teaching at the Institute of Psychiatry, a very organically based psychiatric group in London, and they were teaching all the psychiatrists about the brain, and the neurologists came in, and they had a philosophy basically of organic psychiatry. So I listened to those people and was completely swayed back and thought maybe the structural side is interesting, which means more interesting. and maybe operating on the brain would be even more interesting. So I came back and then went back to London and did 7 years. And during my time in London, I got interested in, sort of by chance, subarachnoid hemorrhages and blood flow. And as these things happen to people that do research, someone walked in, someone like Mike, my boss, said, "What about doing 800 estimations of cerebral blood flow on your patients?" And I thought that sounded like fun. And so over the next 18 months, I was given a drug and a placebo, and we did lots of research to prove the point that this particular drug, nimodipine, increased blood flow. And I wrote up the paper saying it had no effect whatsoever, so we couldn't get it published. So that started another little argument, because I thought surely negative results are very important. So that was another interesting thing about how do you creatively get out there and get your ideas into the literature, and we finally did. But I came back to Auckland, and my first slide meant I fell upon surgeons have to use pictures, so I'll call upon my first introduction really to real research back in Auckland when I came back in '87 was meeting Professor Richard Fall, and he said, "You seem to be taking out some specimens of the human brain. I think some of that should be come across to my laboratory, and we need to speak to the patients and get them very involved, and they'll all want to do it." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, of course they will," and he was right. Every patient that's had an epilepsy operation since 1987 really has donated their brain to Richard's research. And there was great enthusiasm about understanding the basis of epilepsy, looking at the cells and the connections and noradrenaline and the cannabinoid receptors. And Mike and his team, Richard and Mike Dragonoff, have produced wonderful research. Jenny Ogden, who was a very good colleague of Mike, was also a very persuasive person, and she said all your patients should go into neuropsychology outcome studies. I thought that could be a bit challenging for a surgeon, having someone looking at your results, but she was very keen to do that, and we did a lot of work on subarachnoid hemorrhage patients and outcome, and it was a great collaboration. So again, I was a passive partner providing patients to creative individuals who want to do research. And Ruth Benita, who's gone from Auckland but in the World Health Organization, was an international epidemiologist. So she was looking at stroke incidence and how many patients were coming into our department, and was a world authority. So I had an epidemiologist, a psychologist, and brain anatomist, so it was a very good start. And I've stuck on their coattails ever since.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Edward. It's good to have people's coattails to fall upon. Donna Rose, have you had any coattails to follow? There you are in the School of Psychology at University of Auckland, and you're a professor, and what are your research interests and sort of your mentors in that?
Well, I got into research really because I was interested in how people are able to keep a record of their own personal history. So I actually started out my career in the Faculty of Arts in history, and became really fascinated by this, and was also doing psychology with people such as Mike and Jenny Ogden actually giving fascinating lectures about the brain, and this really captured my interest. And eventually I came to this point of really wanting to understand how it was that the brain could basically be our sense of self, and our sense of the past. And so then I went on a Commonwealth scholarship to University of Toronto, where I finally got the chance to kind of dive into brain imaging, which at that point was just getting off the ground really, particularly when it comes to looking at these very kind of elusive processes of the brain, such as creativity and autobiographical memory and identity. So over the course of my career then, I've looked at how memory plays a role in many different aspects of our daily lives, and one of these is our sense of identity. And so they're finding that when individuals have Alzheimer's disease and they begin to lose their memories, particularly from their early adulthood, there becomes these quite obvious changes in their sense of self. And then another aspect of my research has been to look at the neural correlates, so the brain networks that actually help us to mentally time travel, so to be able to project ourselves back into a moment of the past and really fully re-experience that moment. But then what became obvious to us is that we don't just go back into the past when we're mind wandering, we're going all over the place, and another destination is the future, and humans spend a lot of time thinking about their futures. And so we've really focused in on that and looked to see how the brain networks that support memory actually are quite involved in how we imagine the future, which got me interested in imagination, which of course is highly linked to creativity.
Thank you very much. So let's cut straight to the chase, Michael. So what is a creative brain?
Well, I think a creative brain is something that creates connections. So it's not sort of tied to the immediate environment. The whole business of mind wandering and dreaming and daydreaming is making connections that often come up randomly. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is to recognize when it's something new and useful. By the way, I think the best model for creativity is evolution, because that's exactly how evolution works. Through random changes that either increase fitness or reduce fitness. So the extraordinary diversity of living creatures on the earth is a result of random changes that are selected, and that's creativity. And I think the brain operates in the same way, by producing random changes that are then either selected or not selected. And that's the tricky part, I think, to decide what it is about a new connection or a new idea that is useful and creative. So I don't think there's any problem creating connections or creating funny ideas. The real problem, I think, is to figure out, and this is, again, a brain problem, what is useful, what is meaningful, what is going to please people, and of course, these days, what's going to make money.
The whole innovation, the commercial side of creativity. So just to come back to something you just said then, so is there a context or a situation that, in terms of evolution, that fostering the randomness that you mentioned, is there a identifiable situation where randomness is, I'll use the word fostered again, fostered, allowed, and given air?
Well, I mean, there are lots of ways, I think, to increase randomness and increase mind wandering. I mean, one of them is drugs, of course. I mean, the 19th century literature depended on opium. So that's one way, of course, that people, and alcohol, I mean, people have used drugs, of course, to have creative ideas. Of course, then you blunt the selection, I think. You don't always recognize, if you're under the influence of a drug, that the sort of crazy idea you have might work. I think, things like music and dance probably, and the environment that you're in can also encourage you to think more broadly than if you're sitting in front of a computer.
Mm-hmm. So can we train creativity? So there's the whole sort of, you're either born a creative genius or then you're educated to be creatively genius. I mean, what's your view on that whole sort of born to be a genius? So some people just are creative wonders, or people grow into and develop their creative skills?
I don't think we really know. I mean, I think probably some people are intrinsically more creative than others. Some kids have more mind wandering than other kids in class. We all know that. So I think there is a sort of natural variation there in the extent to which people mind wander and have new ideas and see new connections. I mean, Einstein, for example, was a kind of famous mind wanderer. He developed his ideas by imagining all sorts of extraordinary scenarios involving traveling on the edge of a light beam and that sort of thing. So I'm sure there are variations. I think possibly there are environments that kind of dampen down mind wandering. Mm-hmm. A lot of people feel guilty about mind wandering, and I think that's partly through their experience at school, when they're told off for not paying attention, or their parents tell their children that they must pay attention. So there is this sort of dampening down, which I think we need to think about, how we can actually let people's minds and children's minds kind of wander freely without necessarily punishing them. But then on the other hand, that has to be sort of set against the fact that the kid's got to learn something. So in school, you also want them to learn. So I don't quite know how we achieve that balance, but I'm not sure that we're achieving it very well at the moment.
That's my struggle as well. It's what I'm spending a lot of time on. So, Donna Rose, when you were sort of in either university, school, or wherever, can you remember moments when you felt creative, switched on to being a creative thinker? Or when you thought, this is killing me?
Well, I think certainly being under stress is one of the things that really dampens down my own creativity, when my mind feels crowded by, I guess, external demands. When I have some mental space, then, you know, I'm able to sort of mind wander more. And I think then you start kind of making these kind of freer associations between ideas, and things just seem to like pop into mind. But I think often that's because even if you're not really aware of it, your mind is still processing a lot of, you know, different kinds of problems that are going on for you, or things that you need to solve. But just having that mental space is actually really important. So I think even not just for children, I think it's really important that academics, that, you know, people in corporate environments have that space to think. And I guess this is one of the things that corporations like Google and that have tried to foster by having, you know, kind of less rules and regulations and kind of more, you know, ability to let your mind wander.
Great. So Edward, how do you find place and space to think creatively or to question and reflect?
Neurosurgeons never admit to any thoughts like that at all.
Great.
Though I was trained by a boss who was quite creative in London, and it used to be quite disturbing because he'd come in the morning and there'd be the patient being anaesthetized for a subarachnoid hemorrhage or a clipping of an aneurysm, which he was an expert. And I'd be sitting learning from him, and we'd be in the tea room, and it's a fairly amount of stress before an operation like that because it's life and death. And he'd always come in and say, "Was the patient nervous?" And I said, "Pardon, sir?" He said, "Was the patient nervous?" And I could see he was nervous. And then I would start to feel nervous. And he would really hype himself up into this state of great stress. And then he'd walk into the theatre and just operate like a dream. And it would go beautifully. And he said, "That's good, isn't it?" And it would be a complete switch on. So he psyched himself into the state of heightened anxiety and sort of deflected it onto the patient. The patient must be nervous. And if things went wrong, was this patient nervous or not? He could be bleeding. The patient would be bleeding to death, and you'd say, "Well, I don't think they were nervous before," you know. But and then I had a wonderful contrast because I was taught by a black neurosurgeon in London who was the most research-orientated surgeon. So he's beating the English at their own game, really. And he was a fabulous chap. And he had the opposite approach to starting an operation. And he would just put up the scan, and everyone would be ready and be waiting to go, and there'd be dead silence. And he'd wander over, and he'd put on a bit of reggae on the CD player. We'd all be waiting, and he'd wait and wait, and it was just like he calmed everything right down, until you were almost immobile. And then he said, "Let's start." So there are different ways surgeons get themselves into a creative space for operating. But I think it's got nothing to do with what you asked me. But
no, it's got not a bit, but for not one moment did my mind wander. So that's so what I'm wanting to know in all of this, and again, all of you can answer. So what's happening in the brain during the creative process? Like, so, you know, you're playing a piece of music for the first time. What is the brain doing in all of that? Michael, help me.
Donna's actually the best person to answer this. But
Donna.
Well, okay.
Yeah, Donna, take a bit of break.
Well, I think in terms of when you're trying to generate new ideas, that's what I've really kind of focused on, is how we actually generate the new ideas to begin with. And I think part of what's going on is that we're, you know, having to kind of access these stores of information that we have in our memories. But we're sort of almost like kind of accessing them in a sort of random fashion sometimes, searching through them, trying to find what might kind of go together in ways that can sort of provide us perhaps with a creative solution to our problem, or be a meaningful expression of whatever we're trying to express. And so in terms of what's going on in the brain then, we're finding that there's these large, what we call large-scale whole brain networks, and I think that's really important. That really links into what Mike was saying before, that it really isn't that it's one side of the brain or the other that's really engaged. It's these networks that span the entire brain. And so not only, this is quite a small brain here, Ed's small brain, not only do you have regions in the frontal cortex and also in the temporal lobe here, looking at the outside of the brain, but if we look at the inside surface, we also have regions right across the brain, in the frontal cortex, parietal, occipital, that give you all the visual imagery, the auditory kind of imagery, I guess, if you like, that comes along with these sorts of creative ideas. And so when you're pulling together these pieces of information and making links, and what we've found to be really critical is actually that it's a memory structure in the brain that seems to be really crucial for a generation of ideas. And so we think this isn't just kind of going back into those memory stores and pulling out individual ideas, but there's something in this region, it's called the hippocampus. There's something in this region that allows it to make links. So I've often described it to students as being kind of a glue gun. So it really kind of holds things together. So it actually holds the elements of our memories together, but then it also allows us to form these new creative ideas by creating links between things that could be completely disparate, ideas that would normally never go together. This region, the hippocampus, can actually then form those links between those ideas. So when we have people in the scanner engaged in the creative process, we see this region become very active in both the left hippocampus and the right hippocampus. And there was a really interesting study actually that was getting authors they gave authors blurbs about books. So it would be like, here's a new novel, I want you to design a cover for this novel. And so they actually trained these artists to draw without looking at what they were drawing, because when you're lying flat in a scanner, you can't move. And we really don't want you moving any part of your body, because then that will move your head around. So it's quite a challenge to look at creativity in that scanning environment. And so they taught them to draw on a little tablet that was on their lap, and they weren't allowed to even move their shoulder while they were doing this. So it was very restricted. But they would draft an idea for the cover, and then they would have to evaluate it. So that's that kind of looking at whether it was meaningful, whether it was, what they thought about it. And so when they were in that generation phase, the hippocampus was pretty much one of the only regions that was just very strongly activated while they were, engaged in that process. Yeah.
Something I might add that's sort of interesting, I think, is that people their minds tend to wander more creatively, not when they're doing nothing, and not when they're doing something that's quite engaging, but when they're doing something trivial, like washing the dishes or listening to people like me. Or I used to do pottery at one time, and things like that don't require a lot of concentration, but some seem to be the kind of environment when people's minds wander most creatively, I believe.
It's quite interesting. In Finland, where I'm interested in obviously education, they've just changed the curriculum to introduce or to increase the amount of craft work, knitting, small activities in formal part of their curriculum to allow time and space just to talk, to just get your mind and just to have a skill as well. And part of it is, I'm sure, is just to have a mindful but relaxing activity. And it's an interesting, Finland being one of the countries of the world that's been regarded as having the best education system with the best outcomes, and they are going away from maths and science, and they're going into knitting, painting, music, and actually trying to empty the curriculum from as much of things as possible. So it's an interesting thing altogether.
Having the mind half full, I think that's
yes.
the answer.
So I had a question that I wanted when I was looking at something you wrote, Michael, and I'm coming to you, Edward, but the difference between brain and mind. I sort of want...
Yes, that's a very good question, Michael. We like that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think
I'm
it's a
sorry.
I think it's a no-brainer, actually. I mean, I kind of think without a brain you can't have a mind. And so I think even many philosophers now talk about the mind-brain as being the same entity. I think the mind is what brains do. They make minds. They make up your mind.
Like the liver squeezes out bile?
Yeah, that's right. The brain squeezes out mind. That's right.
That's clearer, Michael.
So
What do you
Edward-
think?
Oops.
I ask that question all the time. There is no answer yet. This is the great
Oh,
thing.
come
We're on a
on.
little experimental study of this.
You think there's mind floating around somewhere with
No,
no
I
brain?
think it's all in the brain, but I
Well,
just
there you
don't
go.
think we're not very understanding. Can I show a few more
Yes,
slides?
yes,
about,
please.
We've been talk about how Donna images the stuff, because as a neurosurgeon, I'm the least skeptical of the 7 neurosurgeons in town. You could have had the other 6 here saying, what, creativity? We all get a little bit sort of hard-nosed about looking at the bad side of the brain, diseases and things going wrong, and we really think about when the brain is functioning well or being super good, which is being creative. But the imaging is what Donna was speaking about, and I can take you through a few steps as a sort of stage 1 neurosurgery on imaging. This was a fantastic afternoon. I think it was a Saturday afternoon. I was lucky enough to be a house surgeon, and in came this machine. And you see we all wore paisley shirts with long hair and beards, and we had these beautiful old screens, and this is the first CT scan being done in Auckland. And this was such a revolution. I had just started my house surgeon job in neurosurgery, and the other surgeons showed me what they used to do to try and work out if there was a problem inside your head. So if you came in with a stroke, the surgeons might say, well, that might be a blocked artery, or it could be a blood clot over the surface of the brain, or it could be a tumor, could be anything really that could affect the brain. And they would do an air encephalogram, which meant that they would take you into a room, strap you into a chair, and spin you upside down after they'd done a lumbar puncture and pumped air into your spinal column to give you an air bubble over the top of your head. So you had the most excruciating headache you could imagine, and they held you there upside down for a while to see if the air bubble would shift one way or the other. And that was the state of our understanding or imaging the brain in 1977. So when this came along, and suddenly these grainy pictures came out of a patient with a big white thing on one side, and the brain shifted over, very poor pixelation or resolution, but it was enough to say there's a blood clot on that side of the brain. Isn't that amazing? Straight to theatre. So the whole idea of doing air encephalograms, or even worse, you may think, taking the patient and drilling exploratory burr holes, which is what put a lot of people off neurosurgery, because every case that came in at night would have exploratory burr holes, and we would be there all night drilling holes on both sides of the head, saying, looks all right to me, looks all right to me. Nothing here, sew it up. And that's exactly what we did. There was exploratory burr. So the CT scan was such a revolution, and I was there day 1. So the next one, even more fortuitous, I happened to get to Bart's Hospital in London as part of my training, and they had a very big trust fund, and they said, we are putting in the first clinical MRI machine in London. And it was there, and the same thing, I was standing there, and suddenly it wasn't a blurry image. It was like an anatomical dissection of the brain with the gyral pattern, the hippocampus, you could spot it, you could see the basal ganglia, you could see inside the head after 45-minute examination, and this occurred basically in 1985. And we're moving on. Next little step was, this is a fantastic image which John Wilson produced for me, and this is the first functional scan, functional MRI, which a lot of Donna's work is about functional imaging, trying to look at the brain while it's doing something. And John Wilson, the radiologist, came to us and said, look, I've got this new technique. We'll just go back one. If I get the patient to lie on the MRI scan very still, because as Donna said, you can't move around much, but I'll get them just to move their right thumb. And that tiny movement is generated by the motor cortex of the brain. And while you're doing that, the blood flow increases in a tiny amount to the area of the brain that controls your thumb only. And that, John Wilson told me, and I had to believe him, this little red spot here was the patient's thumb movement. And behind it was a little black shadow, which was the patient's tumor. And he said that little black shadow you could take out because it's not in the motor strip and you won't paralyze the patient, because I know where the motor strip is. And that was, again, a complete revolution for us to be able to see movement taking place in the patient and localize it to the scan, and allowed us to operate right next to the motor strip, which used to be a no-go area, just like the language areas are basically no-go for neurosurgeons. And then just another little bit, the last part was, and this is sort of, again, a very interesting area, the imaging now says that they can look at the brain and find those big tracks, those things going from front to back, which are carrying the axons, the information from the neurons at the occipital lobe where vision's taking place up to the frontal lobe or down to the temporal lobe. These big bundles can be seen on the MRI. And so tracked imaging is available. And this is a patient who had their language circuit image. This is the language area up front on the left side for most people, named after a neurologist, a general surgeon, Broca. And this is the bundle of fibers that connects the comprehension of language over in the superior temporal lobe. So there's a connecting bundle of fibers which the imaging can see. And this is the patient's tumor. And we thought, that is amazing. Now, all our operations are going to be image guidance, and we'll know exactly where we are. It's not quite as simple as that. And my creative thought, the only one for this lecture, was, what's this? This is New York. And you could say, well, what are the people doing where it lights up like that, inside that particular apartment? And this is sort of like the maps that they produce when they're doing things. And the imaging has to be then tweaked by the neuroradiologist to say, no, let's suppress all that stuff and just give you the hottest spot in the brain, and that's where they're thinking their creative thoughts. Do I believe them? I sort of believe them, but I am a little bit of a skeptic. Some of this is a lot of processing, and I leave you with that image, and that's the end of your neurosurgical training.
So, I could be way off the top here, but I read was reading this article, and it was about dance in the brain, a review. And it basically says, dance training changes both grey and white matter structure of the brain, which I'm not really sure. I'm wanting to know, in regard to sort of no-go zones that you don't go to, and the whole concept of brain plasticity and sort of, I mean, if the brain, if some part of the brain is damaged, then the brain is it feverishly working at another way of protecting, solving a problem using different networks. And if the brain is busily doing that, then are the no-go zones moving, shifting? Help me here.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that is the really fascinating thing for neurosurgeons. And there is a neurosurgeon, a French neurosurgeon, who operates in a lot of cases with low-grade tumor processes. So when you do the scan, it looks almost like normal brain, but there's a sort of graying shadow in amongst, say, your language area.
Yeah.
And these people may have had transient speech arrest or language problems where they just can't speak as fluently. So something is irritating or damaging their language area, and the scan shows that there's something there. Now, he says, I can go into that area, which you didn't used to go into, because language has moved out of that. This slow-growing tumor has been there so long that language has just moved away. And sure, the language may not be perfect, there may be some hesitation, but if you take that tumor out of what you thought was the language area, the inferior frontal gyrus, named after Broca, the patient will probably be able to speak. But he says, you better do the operation awake, just in case I'm wrong. So we take the tumor out with the patient awake, reading at the same time.
So, and this is where we start taking the drugs. So I'm now going to I'm going to jump a bit all over the place to Donna Rose, because I was, again, reading something that you wrote about, and you talked about the role of emotion and how it helps the recall. You spoke before about the recall and the role of emotion. And I'm sort of interested in that, and how, I suppose from a teaching learning perspective, if I'm wanting to help people recall, then I should be attaching that mathematical skill to some emotional activity so as they can remember the mathematics, so as they're going to be better at it or whatever. So
Well, I guess I would say that if you attached anything that you're trying to learn, if you can link it to something else, that immediately will help you remember that better. And that's because then you're engaging your hippocampus. And so, as I mentioned before, the hippocampus is really trying to make links between information, but it is critical for encoding new memories, so forming new memories, but then also being able to retrieve those memories later. And it's almost like the richer the memory that you can construct, sort of almost gives you more ways to get into that memory later. Because it seems like if you can kind of find or reactivate one aspect of a memory, say perhaps the context, so say perhaps you've been in this room before, maybe in 1995 when you were doing Romeo and Juliet. That wasn't me, but there were some photos outside. So if that person came back in here and is in this context, it may then bring those memories back because you sort of reinstating part of the memory, and then the rest of it will just kind of what we call pattern completion. So the rest of the memory will just follow. That doesn't always happen, of course. Quite often we're searching having to search quite hard to find a particular memory. So there it's, perhaps if you have emotions that can, maybe kind of bring, if it's an emotional memory, sometimes it can help, sometimes it can impair. So I think that's something to, I think we all sort of know those experiences that were, kind of very emotional, sometimes positive even, but, maybe quite often it's negative, intense and negative emotion that can almost leave you to have like a little bit of temporary amnesia, like you sort of don't encode that memory. And one of my colleagues has looked at how quite often we lose all the details around something and we might just focus on that central emotional aspect of that memory. And so then we're not encoding something that's very rich. Then it might just be, if someone's pointing a gun at you, you'll only remember perhaps the gun and not what the offender looked like or all these other kinds of details that are actually, quite critical.
I was asking, university's just started, as we the end of week 2 now or something, and I asked my first year students the other day to write down all the qualities of a good teacher and sort of things they remember. And they all remembered lots of things, very little to do with dancing, but a lot to do with caring, well-being, listening, or a lot of competencies that are underpinning. But the thing that interests me, that they remembered the teacher, they remembered a person as the key into the remembering thing. And it's something that you mentioned in this article that you wrote about, the familiarity of a person, and that's a key entry into recalling.
That's right.
So the whole thing of having I suppose it's the peopleness of the brain that is really interesting to me, and sort of how we have to attend to the whole being and the whole way the person engages with other people, and that's important. So I sort of want to just ask you how we can value or use that sort of connecting memory and recall with people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we are inherently so social, and so whenever we're looking at people's imaginations, they always involve other people and themselves, of course, as well. And I think, being able to link, being able to link things to particular people then may bring other richness with that. If we can think about, if we're trying to plan the future, so in that study, I think that you're talking about a study here where we were actually getting people to imagine things that might be coming up in their future, but then we wanted to see if they would actually form memories of those imaginations so that later, when they're faced with that particular situation, they can actually draw on how they imagined it playing out, or any sort of troubleshooting that they'd already done in their minds about how they would deal with that situation. And it was that we found that really, like, if they're imagining things that involve people that they know really well, that brings along with it a whole richness of detail. The simulation that they create, so the imagined event that they create, is much more plausible. And then it can be kind of almost scaffolded into memory. So if we can attach it to the scaffolding that we already have, the knowledge that we already have, then we're able to kind of integrate that new memory into our knowledge bank.
It's fascinating. Michael, I'm going to cut to the something you wrote in your book, The Wandering Mind, and he'll sign. I'm sure everyone can have a look. I'm going to read this. Above all, mind wandering is the source of creativity, the spark of innovation that leads in the longer run to an increase rather than a decrease in well-being. It is even suggested that we have entered a new era of education that recognizes creativity and problem solving rather than simply drilling the rote memorization of facts and figures. I wish Stephen Joyce was right here, right now. But anyway, so tell me about this new era of education. What do you go forward into 20 years' time? What's it going to look like in regard to creativity, education,
I'm just
innovation?
trying to push sales, actually.
Well, it worked. It worked. I'll just steal the book. So do you have any visions? Creative?
Well, I mean, I think when you mentioned the Finnish experiment a little while ago from Finland, I think that's probably the kind of thing where children are not so much rote learned things, but are given the chance to solve problems. I mean, that puts a great onus on the instructors, I think, to find problems that are going to be meaningful for them. I also think, giving kids their head space more, a little bit.
Yeah.
But then again, all this, as I said before, has to be weighed up against the fact that in order to be creative, you've got to learn something. I mean, you can't be creative as a computer programmer or even a writer if you can't write. So I think it always has to be a balance. But I think I'll simply say again that I'm not sure that the balance is right. And I'm not sure how you get it right. Maybe it's got something to do with how things are programmed during the day, so that things are not sort of compressed into periods where kids have to sort of pay attention for long stretches of time. There's a lot of talk these days about mindfulness. I'm not sure about that, to be perfectly honest. In at least some definitions of mindfulness, which is very popular in almost every sphere of therapy these days, in some definitions of it, it sounds very constraining, because the idea of mindfulness, I think, is to focus very exclusively on your own body and on the present. And mind wandering is exactly the opposite. It's really trying to take people out of the present so that they think about the future and the past. And they also, of course, think about imaginary times. So I think literature, reading literature is important. I mean, we've always known this, really, because it takes us into spaces that are freer and therefore kind of prepares you for eventualities much better than if you lock people in or kids in to sort of set routines. So part of it is to encourage mind wandering, I think, rather than mindfulness, although mindfulness may be a kind of counter to it. If you kind of lock people into the present, into their mindful routines, then maybe they can then stretch their minds a bit better in subsequent sessions. I don't have a clear answer. I mean, I just hope that we get the balance right, but I think it's kind of silly to sort of get carried away with an idea that mightn't work. I sort of think these things have to be introduced and tested to some extent before they become wholesale philosophies. But I would think a move towards more flexible kind of learning, problem solving rather than rote learning of times tables or whatever kids learn would help.
Thank you. So slightly, again, on a tangential thing, Edward, when some people have a brain injury, you would think, things are closing down, but sometimes skills and abilities really become electric and a whole new skills open up. This whole, inner virtuoso appears.
So I've read.
So the question is, do you believe science or surgery will find a way for everyone to tap into their inner virtuoso? And if so, can you start doing something for my brain now?
I had a little warning there might be a question around
Or
this.
drugs.
Just so I have a little slide. I see people with tumours, brain hemorrhages, head injuries as part of my daily job. No one yet has told me they're much better after it. So, and I deal with about 300 people a year, so I've dealt with 10 or 12, 15,000 people. No one has said that was a really good thing for me. Now I'm a virtuoso on the piano, or even write books, or so no one that I've experienced. But I looked into this a little bit, because the idea of a savant that suddenly appears after a head injury is in the literature, especially the Atlantic Monthly and other pieces like that. And there has been a little bit of real science done on it. I've looked it up, and there's about 300 known savants in the world. I'm not sure how many we have here tonight. But there is a list of them. And these are naturally occurring savants, and there's 30 recorded ones that have occurred after injury. So it's a rare thing.
Right.
So very rare. And this article talks about Muybridge, who I, in fact, used to love his stuff because it's the body in motion, and he did these pictures, but he had a bad stagecoach injury, and then he became a great photographer. And they say, see, he was waiting just to spring out and take these wonderful pictures. And there are other examples. There's also examples of, for those jazz aficionados, people like Martino, a great jazz guitarist, that had some seizures in his temporal lobe. They found he had a big arteriovenous malformation. They took it out, damaged his memory quite badly. And the sort of article that makes it sound a bit more interesting said he forgot how to play the guitar. I think he just lost interest in it and was quite profoundly depressed and disinterested afterwards, but got all his skills back and is now on stage and plays absolutely beautiful jazz guitar, which truly is the brain creating something at the moment they're doing it. So I think jazz improvisation, for me, is one of the most creative things anyone could do. And he got it back after having quite severe damage to his temporal lobe.
Yes.
He just got back to where he was. He wasn't suddenly a jazz guitarist from nowhere. But there are some cases. There's one where a chap said he had had a diving accident, dived into a pool, came out and became a great pianist. And if you really, you read the articles, he's a pianist. He's a pianist, but when they've really said, well, okay, he's playing, but he's not a virtuoso.
Wonderful. So I think, Donna Rose, you might have a picture of this, but can you see creativity in action when you scan the brain? And sort of, can you see this is just going to bed brain, and this is a creative brain, and it's different areas lit up?
Yeah, so I think we've got an image up there. I've got a picture here of some of the first, this is actually one of the first neuroimaging studies that we did of imagination, and comparing it to first remembering the past. And so here we're getting individuals to just remember past experiences from their autobiography, but here we're actually getting them to imagine things that have never actually happened. And what was fascinating to us was that just how similar these brain maps were, these maps of activation. I mean, we were actually shocked, I think. We really didn't expect to see that. But then another aspect to this that was really interesting was that region I talked about, the hippocampus, was actually more activated when people imagined. And so that's actually kind of shifted our understanding of what that part of the brain does. So previously we had really thought of it as a memory structure. So of course there's the famous patient HM who had both of his hippocampi removed for treatment for epilepsy. And following that surgery, he was profoundly amnesic. And so that really, right then and there, this back in the 50s, solidified this idea that the hippocampus is really crucial for being able to remember our past. But in the last 10 years, that's changed. And it's really work like looking at how we imagine our futures, but also looking at creativity. And this is really interesting, where a study has recently looked at patients that have very discrete damage that's localized to the hippocampus. So some of these patients have experienced oxygen deprivation that's led to the death of cells in the hippocampus. Some of them have had a form of herpes simplex that's gone to the brain, so herpes simplex encephalitis, and that's attacked their hippocampus. And not only are these people amnesic, but they also can't do creative tasks. So one of the tasks that we get people to do, because it's really tricky to sort of look at creativity in a laboratory environment, really, in an experimental environment. I mean, we need some control over what we're doing so that we can actually get valid results, but how do you get people to just spontaneously, to have those aha moments that are normally spontaneous, but we want them on demand in the lab or in the scanner. And not only
Every
that...
teacher's dream, I mean.
Yeah, and not only that, but they have to do it every 30 seconds. And so that's never going to happen. So what we get people to do is a task that we call divergent thinking. And so here we give individuals an item like paperclip, and we get them to generate as many alternate uses as they can for that particular object. And so most people for paperclip will come up with jewelry. So they'll tell you, well, they'll make a necklace, they'll make earrings, they'll make a bracelet. And then only one of our participants has ever said that they would use paperclips as ice skates for mice. And so this is the very creative aspect to it.
Yeah.
And actually one other person has, because I Googled it, and ice skates for mice, paperclips, and there's a French Christmas card that has this. So, so one other person had thought of that. So that's our way of sort of trying to constrain it in the lab. But that's the fascinating thing, is that these people with hippocampal damage just really cannot come up with other uses. And so now we're understanding that the hippocampus isn't just about the past, but it's about imagining the future, it's about problem solving, it's about thinking in a creative fashion, which has just kind of been quite revolutionary, really.
Yes.
So Donna, how did you know that the paperclip man hadn't seen the postcard?
Well, this is true. Because we disable the internet in our studies.
So I think we're going to sort of start wrapping and coming up so that people can ask questions. So I have two final questions for all of you, and the first one is, how critical is our research here in New Zealand for the future of brain health for New Zealanders? So, Michael.
Goodness. I have to say that most of the research that we do in the School of Psychology is basic research. So we're not sort of fundamentally addressing ourselves to clinical questions, or even, I have to say, to educational questions. So anything then we think about that kind of thing has to be kind of speculative, I think. But I think we are learning an awful lot about how the brain works, what the hippocampus really does, what imagination is, and some of the interesting work, I think, actually comes from rats, whether they ice skate or not. So it turns out that recordings from the rat hippocampus also reflects mind wandering. That is, you can take a rat out of a maze and you can measure activity in the hippocampus, and it's evidently thinking about what it was doing in the maze half a minute ago. And it's also generating trajectories in the maze that it hasn't yet taken. So I think we're beginning to understand that this mind-wandering thing goes back millions of years. So it's embedded in our evolution. It's not something that just humans do, although I think that we do it more elaborately than any other creature, probably, at least we think we do. One other aspect I'd like to mention is that not only do we mentally wander in time and space, we mentally wander into the minds of other people. And that, of course, is what underlies fiction, gossip, soap operas, and the rest of it. And I think that has given to human beings an added dimension to mind wandering. We can imagine that we're other people. And so we can imagine social situations. And this is enormously powerful. And I think that those combinations of wandering in time, space, and into other people's minds, and doing it in an imaginative fashion, creating, imaginary scenarios, is what we're beginning to understand that the human brain does. So we're not sort of locked so much anymore into questions simply about memory, or simply about attention, or simply about perception. And I think that's exciting, and I think it's going to have big implications.
Thank you. Edward, what are your reflections?
I have a few more slides. I think to get some idea of what research can do in your own community and what is being done, you have to realize that all these conditions you read about are affecting people in your community. Now, this person was previously quite a good singer, and they've now got a very large tumor growing in their frontal lobe. And that tumor, as you can imagine, this is an artist's view of it. Here's the tumor here taking up about 70% of the frontal lobe. You can imagine what that tumor does to their creativity. And you can imagine how we can image that. We can take the tumor out, we can take it to the laboratory, to the Center for Brain Research, where there's current research into growth of tumor cells, with the idea that we'd get a better understanding, maybe getting a drug that would act against that cell in the laboratory and then put it back to the patient. So every case has an opportunity for this translational research, where we just act basically as the shoemakers. We're repairing the shoe and we give the old leather to the team over in the laboratory, and there's a very talented group of people wanting to do this sort of research for you. Another case is a poet, New Zealand poet, who came to me and said, I've lost my ability to speak, let alone create. And you can see this is what we believe, these language circuits. This is the frontal Broca's area. This is the understanding. This is the occipital lobe. And that circuit connecting the two has been completely wiped out by that tumor. An aggressive tumor. The patient lived for 4 years after that and struggled with all the operations and radiotherapy that we gave. There's drug investigations going on to say, well, what drugs would be good in the laboratory against those sort of cells if you can grow them? And in the Center for Brain Research, those cells are being grown as we speak. Every operation we do, the team race over from the lab with a little tube, and we get consent from the patient. It goes off, and those tumor cells are being grown. There's probably, I'll skip that one. And I think that's probably just an idea of what I think that can happen. Every case that we do as neurosurgeons, we can link in with the scientists. We can have great links with people like Donna. I've taken out 300 hippocampi, in fact. So there are 300 people around New Zealand that have only one hippocampus, because we've taken the other one out because on MRI imaging it was shrunken and was triggering off temporal lobe seizures, which are fascinating type seizures. And they have auras and they have disturbance of consciousness. And if you take out the shrunken hippocampus, you can fire off and be creative and get back to work. Many people in very creative jobs after that operation firing on one hippocampus. And we have the opportunity for you to go back and examine those 300 people and see what they're doing when they're thinking creative thoughts. So there is a wonderful opportunity here, and I think this is what the Neurological Foundation and the other research is saying. Look, you don't have to think it's all overseas. There is the energy and the patience and the need for it right here, and it's being done.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Donna.
Yeah, I think there's some really exciting clinical research that's going on across the Centre for Brain Research, utilising these techniques, this technology that we have, such as MRI. And some of the work that we've been doing in my own lab has been looking at memory and, more importantly, I think, imagination in psychological disorders such as depression. And what's really interesting there is that we found, like, it's been known for a while that individuals with depression have poorer memory for experiences in their past, but what we found was that actually they're more impaired in terms of imagining their future. And so their imaginations lack the richness of detail that you have when you're not depressed. What I think is really critical about that is that perhaps that is what kind of locks people into the sense of hopelessness and not being able to imagine a brighter future. Also being able to, we know that being able to imagine upcoming experiences provides all sorts of benefits for your psychological well-being. It decreases worry, it enhances your ability to problem solve, to seek social support from other people. And so all these things are really critical. And then also the fact that mind wandering seems to sometimes go awry in individuals with depression, where you may get stuck into particular kinds of patterns of mind wandering, where your brain always goes to those kind of negative places, and that's something that we call rumination. And you can be very ruminative and just kind of going over these very well-worn tracks of thought, and it's sometimes getting yourself out of that mind wandering. And I think that's where the benefits of things like mindfulness can come in and be quite beneficial for people. So there's some really, really great research going on, and then also looking at individuals with dementia, looking at how imagination and creativity changes with healthy aging, how it might get better with aging, all sorts of things.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, all three. I think it would be a great time now to have questions. And Sue, I don't know if you want to field the questions or if we just...
Ralph, thank you, panel. Outstanding. We'll open the floor for questions for about 15 minutes or so, and we're going to start on this side. So if we can have a show of hands, and Alex will field the questions. Thank you. Up.
Hi, Mr. Me. My name's Rewa. You operated on a grade 4 glioblastoma on me in 2006. And I wanted to find out whether you had to use your imagination as well as technology to try to envision what you were going to do and how you were going to perform the resection.
I do remember, actually, because I knew you were a musician and we wondered what music to play while we were operating. And I think you're a classical musician, is that right? So we had to take the jazz off and put on some Bach. Yeah, no, I think surgeons have a different way of approaching operating, and I think most surgeons that do, especially microsurgery, once you're under that microscope, it's like any intense task. It's a very stimulating thing to be operating, and it's a sort of privilege to be there, and if it's going well, obviously, it's a very rewarding thing. And a lot of the skills of just keeping your hands still under a microscope seem to come naturally if you practice it for 14 years, and when you go back into each operation, you try to get back to that sort of state where you know you can operate well.
Thank you. We've got a question just next row behind. Thanks, Alex.
I've got a question for Donna. I'm intrigued by the paper clip. I'm wondering how you can measure creativity in a group of people, their response to a paper clip. I'm in a creative career and I consider myself a creative person. If I had a paper clip put in front of me, I would refuse because I would just find it boring.
I know.
If you gave me if you gave me a leaf, I would react. Do you know what I mean? So I'm just saying that a whole group of people, they would probably respond totally different to different items.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do is that we have a variety of items so that we're not just focusing on one item that, like you say, might be quite personal for one person and not for another, and you might get quite different responses. But we actually look at all these different responses that people generate in a number of ways. And so part of what we're getting at, what we want to try and get at, is people's flexibility, and that's actually something that you mentioned, Mike. And that's actually being able to switch ideas. And so very creative people, I think, actually are able to sort of go between ideas, and it may even be quite quick that you're not even really aware that that's what's going on, or maybe you're very aware that that's going on, and explore different possible options. And so even though it seems like a really boring kind of task, most of we have, I guess, very many ways to kind of score these sorts of results. And then the one other aspect of that is the originality. So that's where we look across all of our respondents that we've ever had and see if anyone has come up with that idea before. But it's such a challenge, and I completely understand exactly what you're saying, that it's like for us to be able to come up with these ways of trying to measure such a complex, dynamic, evolving process that sometimes takes months, years to get into an idea. How do we do that in a scanner? It's just such a difficult challenge. Something we need to think more creatively about, I think.
And I think it's also a good, whilst the microphone goes to the next person, a good thing to remember that, you know, our classrooms, our communities, our lecture halls are full of very diverse people with diverse interests, diverse abilities, diverse aspirations, and to assume that a paperclip or a paper and pen activity is going to appeal to everyone or actually be the right way for that person to show their knowledge or creativity is a huge mistake. So it is to continuously unpack the teaching learning phenomenon so as we can see where creativity actually can happen. Currently, we're sort of pushing down and assuming everyone is going to be happy with a pen and paper sitting down all day, and that's going to be the best way to see knowledge or creativity, which drives me to drink.
I do think that
I know, I have some high quality vodka in this.
I mean, I think one of the actual advantages to this sort of approach is actually that we're trying to uncover the real fundamental building blocks, the kind of machinery that's going on. And so we're really paring it back as much as we can to see, well, what is that kind of machinery underneath this that then all that richness and diversity gets built on top of. And so it's kind of understanding at a fundamental level what sorts of thought processes might be involved is what cognitive neuroscience I think is trying to hone into. Yeah.
Could I ask Donna, please, when you were in Toronto, did you have an opportunity to study or work with Paul Medall and his research into vibrations and sound following the tomatis methods?
No, I did not. And I actually don't know much about that method. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex.
I have to look into that. I'm going to Toronto on Friday, so I can check it out.
Hello, I'm Susan. Hi, Ralph.
Hi.
I've been teaching seniors, those over 65, dance for the past 3.5 years. And they're mostly in their 70s, although I have one gentleman who's just turned 100. Something I've noticed, so this is an observation, but partly a question. What I've noticed is that most of them have never danced, well, if they've danced, it's been social ballroom dancing or dancing when they were younger, and it was never required of them to remember any sequence. Now, most of them, just about all of them in class, find it really difficult to remember any sequence of movement. And this is really an observation about creative and healthy aging. I'm trying all sorts of ways to help them to remember. The 100-year-old man was a dancer, and he can remember every step I give him. He just can't do them quickly enough, because he's 100, fair enough. But those who are capable of doing can just not remember. And I'm wondering if there are any suggestions. How do we develop physical memory of a sequence? So those who have done a little smattering of ballet when they were younger, they can remember, but it seems to be lacking from our education system. I think there's another whole area there to be developed, sequence memory, and I'm just hoping I can find a way for older people to learn how to do this. Any thoughts?
I think it probably does depend on development, unfortunately. I mean, if you've been taught from an early age to dance or remember sequences, then you could probably do it. It's like language. If you don't learn language as a child, you never learn it. So I think it must depend very heavily. As you just said, some of them who had dancing lessons could do it, but the others couldn't. I'm frankly not sure how you would get around that. I mean,
So I should stop worrying about it.
Plasticity, of course, is still present in old age. I mean, I probably should join your dancing class. But I think it sort of, decreases. It's pretty hard to get around it, and a person who's never experienced that kind of learning and memory would be my guess. That's a bit bleak, I'm sorry. Maybe somebody here will be a bit more
I could be more positive.
Good man.
Just on the movement and memory, and movement in particular, as most people know here, poverty of movement is part of Parkinson's disease, and that's a very crippling thing. And stimulation by putting electrodes deep into the movement, controlling centers of the brain, can reverse that very dramatically. So it's not giving you the sequence, but it gets the movement back. And I think that's been one of the truly great advances in neurosurgery, that we've been able to identify the circuit and control of movement, so the pacing of the movement and the rapidness of movement can be challenged by these disease processes, which are losing dopamine deep in the brain, and you can drive that dopamine back out by putting a stimulator. So deep brain stimulation for movement disorder is now happening. There's 20 patients a year in Auckland having those stimulators put in at Auckland Hospital. And in other parts of the world for depression and obsessive compulsive disease, these stimulators have shown to be very effective. So all is not lost. When your memory's gone, we will have developed through hippocampal growth cells in the lab a little implant that we can put in for you.
Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to say firstly that I've taken a break from where I work. I have been working in a prison, and when we introduced dance into the unit that I worked in, specifically cultural dance, the results were absolutely incredible, and the level of therapy and everything that occurred was way deeper, as well as the trust for people to actually share in an environment that doesn't encourage any. And so I'm a big fan of dance, even for people that were from Asian cultures, and we had a couple of guys that didn't speak any English. My question that I had was around the hippocampus. It's something that I haven't looked a lot into in a lot of ways, and what I was wondering is, so I've worked with kids as well as with violent offenders, and if the hippocampus, as you said, is essential for the ability to look into the future, to imagine and to problem solve, what is the effect of guilt on that? Is much known about that? Because I couldn't find a lot of research. Guilt is in pressure in kids with not coping, and guilt is in people that have actually done things that they have every right to feel guilty for.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I've never really thought much about guilt as a particular emotion that might have an effect on the hippocampus, but we do know that being under stress really affects it. So if you, I guess, are holding these sorts of burdens that might be creating for you as an individual a really kind of stressful life, carrying all these experiences with you, then I think that could potentially have an effect. And the interesting thing about stress, because I think this is part of what's going on in people with depression, people with anxiety, people with, and by anxiety I mean really, severe anxiety disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder as well, is that being under chronic stress means you have higher levels of the hormone cortisol, and that actually damages the hippocampus and causes shrinkage of the hippocampus. And so then you end up kind of being, not being able to sort of get yourself out of these forms of thinking in terms of that kind of rumination and getting kind of stuck on things. And so actually something that we're sort of looking into are ways that we can try and develop training to enhance people's creativity and their ability to imagine experiences in their future, and seeing whether that might be able to have an impact on people with depression and with anxiety, and then, by extension, then people that are experiencing things, these other sorts of negative emotions as well.
This is not quite an answer to your question, but there was a famous paper on mind wandering a few years ago that was called "The Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." So there's sort of a negative thing about mind wandering itself, as though we shouldn't do it. We've been punished for doing it as kids and so forth. And part of the reason for that is guilt, I think. People feel guilt if they find their minds wandering off somewhere else. So that's one way in which guilt, I think, comes into the equation.
Thank you. Nina, thank you.
My name is Anthony. What is it that the brain does, or how does it assimilate information or knowledge, or even a poem for that matter, retain it in your mind or your brain, and then recall it? What is it that the brain does to do these things? Because this is very intangible stuff.
It's quite simple, really. You go to Donna's.
It's like my whole career.
You go to Donna's class first, and then you come and do a bit of neurology and neurosurgery, think they don't have the answer, and then you speak to Michael, and then you decide to go dancing.
So I'll answer the question. No, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
A lot of work on the hippocampus that we haven't actually talked about has to do with the strengthening of neuronal connections. So once again, it's the hippocampus that seems to form the connections that form memory. So that we know I think, at a neurophysiological level.
Can I promote a New Zealander? The first operations for epilepsy were done in America, but Murray Faulkner was really New Zealand's first neurosurgeon, and he was operating in Dunedin, I think, just around the 30s and 40s. And he was enticed back to the Maudsley in London, having just opened the Dunedin Neurosurgical Unit, which was the first unit in the country. And there was an epilepsy team there, neurologists, EEG records, and they were doing temporal lobe epilepsy. And Murray Faulkner decided to take out the whole temporal lobe with the hippocampus hanging beneath it. So it was called an en-bloc resection for all these patients that were having this operation for temporal lobe epilepsy, which cured about 60 to 80% of the people with epilepsy. And they sent the en-bloc specimen to the laboratory, and their pathologists were the first people to describe hippocampal sclerosis, or shrinking of the hippocampus, which is the cause for temporal lobe epilepsy. And it was a New Zealand Murray Faulkner collaborating with a team that defined that for the world.
Brilliant. Okay, last question. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Chris. As to consciousness or higher consciousness, does the panel have an opinion as to whether it's a byproduct of the brain or mind or external to the brain or mind? I'm hereby referring to a book by Evan Alexander. I think he wrote it about 2008, you may have heard of it. He's a renowned brain surgeon at Harvard, and he went into a coma for a period of 7 days, and he came back. Now, before this event, he was an atheist, okay? But when he came back, he was a committed Christian. So does the panel have a comment on that?
His father was a renowned neurosurgeon.
Yes.
And he was a neurosurgeon.
Yeah, his father was the same. Yeah, he followed in the footsteps.
He wasn't quite as renowned as his father, and a lot of neurosurgeons don't believe his book. And there's been some controversy about the book in terms of what he did say happened and what actually happened. So I think that book, in my mind, is not really talking about anything new.
Anyone else have an opinion?
I think as neuroscientists, we're obliged to think that it's all in the brain, but that in itself is an act of faith, I think. I mean, we've got no other avenue we can take, really, but almost every aspect of the mind that we know about has some connection with activity in the brain. So I think we really sort of, in a way, have to adopt the faith that it's in the brain, not floating around somewhere else.
Okay, so we'll be awaiting the future on that.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing to say, of course, is we don't understand it completely. I mean, it's going to take another 1,000 years at least to understand how the brain makes mind in all of its particular manifestations, I think.
But there have been many of those near-death experiences recorded where people die on the operating table and they see themselves floating above it and they have this dreamlike state. I mean, does that really tell us anything about other consciousness? It just tells us that the mind can do that if you're starved of oxygen. You can have a wonderful dream.
It tells us about the brain, I think.
Yeah. I think we can imagine wonderful things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're
Thank you,
getting pretty
ladies and
deep.
gentlemen, for your very good questions. Panel, outstanding evening discussion. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed the piles and piles of papers and the yellow post-it notes attached all over Associate Professor Buck's research that went into tonight. I think there's a book in the making. Ralph, thank you so much for all of your incredible input into preparation for tonight. You've obviously done an incredible amount of work prior to this evening, and it certainly came through in the questioning. So thank you. Ralph found out that he was going to be chairing this evening's panel discussion while he was on holiday, and found out that the committee at the University of Auckland had nominated him in his absence. So
Never go on holiday.
Thank you. And Mike, Edward and Donna Rose, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. A fantastic combination of experience and huge talent. And I'm sure that the audience will agree that it's been a wonderful combination. So sincere thank you. And I'd like to also congratulate Professor Donna Rose Addis, who was promoted just before Christmas at a very tender age that's somewhere below 40. So big congratulations. Edward's just checking her age. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many people in the audience that we recognise this evening as supporters of the Neurological Foundation. You should be very proud of what you have helped to achieve over the past 45 years. If you're not a member of the Foundation and you would like to be, I'm sure out the front you will have noticed that there are blue copies of the latest issue of Headlines newsletter, and there is a joining membership slip inside. Please join us as we continue this journey, and you will be updated on events like this in the future and get first dibs on seats as well. So panel, once again, thank you very much. Audience, thank you for travelling through the traffic this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for your support. Good night.